Chapter 10, Dilemmas of Free Trade by Bruce E. Moon. International trade is often treated purely as an economic matter that can and should be divorced from politics. This is a mistake because trade not only shapes our economy, but also determines the kind of world in which we live. The far-reaching consequences of trade pose fundamental choices for all of us. Citizens must understand these consequences before judging the inherently controversial issues that arise over trade policy. More than that, we cannot even make sound consumer decisions without weighing carefully the consequences of our own behavior. The case for trade. The individual motives that generate international trade are familiar. Consumers seek to buy foreign products that are better or cheaper than domestic ones in order to improve their material standard of living. Producers sell their products abroad to increase their profit and wealth. Most policymakers believe that governments should also welcome trade because it provides benefits for the nation and the global economy, as well as for the individual. Exports produce jobs for workers, profits for corporations, and revenues that can be used to purchase imports. Imports increase the welfare or well-being of citizens because they can acquire more for their money, as well as obtain products that are not available from domestic sources. The stronger economy that follows can fuel increasing power and prestige for the state in international affairs. Further, the resultant interdependence and shared prosperity among the countries can strengthen global cooperation and maintain international peace. Considerable historical evidence supports the view that trade can improve productivity, consumption, and therefore material standard of living. Trade successes have generated spurts of national growth, most notably in East Asia. The global economy has grown most rapidly during periods of trade expansion, especially in the years after World War II, and has slowed when trade levels have fallen, especially during the Great Depression of the 1930s. Periods of international peace have also coincided with trade-induced growth, while war has followed declines in trade and prosperity. Globally, trade has grown from 12% of gross domestic product, GDP, as the total goods and services produced in a given year in 1960 to 30% today, and average incomes are more than 2.5 times larger. Yet trade is no panacea, as witnessed by patterns of trade and economic growth since the end of World War II. Global growth exceeded 5% per year for the first 35 years of that period, when trade averaged under 15% of GDP. However, during the globalization era since 1980, marked by trade levels of about 25% of GDP, growth fell to under 3%. Furthermore, the group of countries that have lagged behind over this period began as the most active traders in the world. Sub-Saharan Africa's trade levels were more than twice the global average in 1960, but for half a century per capita income in Africa has grown barely 0.5% per year. At this pace, Africa will not reach the income level that rich countries have attained by 1960 for nearly 400 years. Meanwhile, the rich countries, which historically relied much less on trade, have grown almost 4 times as fast. This mixed record suggests that trade can have either positive or negative consequences. Still, the private benefits of trade have led individual consumers and producers to embrace it with zeal for the past half-century. As a result, trade has assumed a much greater role in almost all nations, with exports now resulting over a third of the economy in most countries and over half in many. Even in the United States, which is less reliant on trade than virtually any other economy in the world because of its size and diversity, the export sector now constitutes more than 10% of GDP. Since World War II, most governments have encouraged and promoted this growth in trade levels, though they have also restrained and regulated trade in a variety of ways. All but a handful of nations now rely so heavily on jobs in the export sector and on foreign products to meet domestic needs that discontinuing trade is no longer an option. To attempt it would require a vast restructuring that would entail huge economic losses and massive social change. Furthermore, according to the quote-unquote liberal trade theory accepted by most economists, governments have no compelling reason to interfere with the private markets that achieve such benefits. The reader is cautioned that the term liberalism, as used throughout this chapter, refers to liberal economic theory that opposes government interference with the market and is not to be confused with the ambiguous way the term liberal is applied in U.S. politics, where it often means the opposite. From its roots in the work of Scottish political economist Adam Smith and English economist David Ricardo, the liberal perspective has emphasized that international trade can benefit all nations simultaneously without requiring government involvement. According to Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, no one needs to lose in order for another to win, because trade allows a total global production to rise. The key to creating these gains from trade is the efficient allocation of resources, whereby each nation specializes in the production of goods in which it has a comparative advantage. For example, a nation with especially fertile farmland and a favorable climate can produce food much more cheaply than a country that lacks this comparative advantage. If it were to trade its excess food production to a nation with efficient manufacturing facilities for clothing production, both nations would be better off, because trade allows each to apply its resources to the most efficient use. Liberals contend that no action by governments is required to bring about this trade, since profit-motivated investors will see to it that producers specialize in the goods in which they have a comparative advantage, and consumers will naturally purchase the best or cheapest products. Thus, liberal theory concludes that international trade conducted by private actors free of government control will maximize global welfare. Challenges to the liberal faith in trade. Though trade levels have grown massively in the 2 centuries since Adam Smith, no government has followed the advice of liberal economic theorists to refrain from interfering with trade altogether. This is partly because governments also have been influenced by a dissenting body of thought known as mercantilism, which originated with the trade policy of European nations, especially England, from the 16th to the middle of the 19th centuries. While mercantilists do not oppose trade, they do hold that governments must regulate it in order for trade to advance various aspects of the national interest. The aspirations of mercantilists go beyond the immediate consumption gains emphasized by liberals to include long-term growth, national self-sufficiency, the vitality of key industries, and a powerful state in foreign policy. They are especially wary of trade patterns that offer immediate benefits but constrain long-term growth. For example, the slow-growing African economies to specialize in their export of mining and tropical agriculture products that do not require either skilled labor or high technology. Because neither the products themselves nor the production techniques have changed much in decades, such specializations are developmental dead ends. Furthermore, many poor countries are dangerously reliant on just a few such products. 2/3 of African countries generate more than half of their export revenues from just 3 or 4 products. In 6 African countries, one product accounts for more than 85% of exports. Contrast the resultant stagnation with the spectacular burst of new products and processes that have emerged from the digital revolution in computer and information technology. Developed nations that export such products derive high profits, well-paying jobs, and dynamic economic and social change. Clearly, the value of trade depends heavily on its composition. Because most states accepted the mercantilist conviction that trade can have negative as well as positive consequences, they tried to manage it in a fashion that will minimize its most severe costs, yet also capture the benefits claimed for it by liberal theory. It is a fine line to walk. Mercantilists also observe that the rosy evaluation of trade advanced by Smith and Ricardo was predicated on their expectation that any given nation's imports would more or less balance its exports. However, when a nation's imports are greater than exports, meaning it buys more than other nations than it sells to them, mercantilists warn that this trade deficit carries with it potential dangers that may not be readily apparent. On its face, a trade deficit appears as the proverbial free lunch. If the nation's imports are greater than exports, it allows the national consumption. It follows that national consumption must exceed its production. One might ask how anyone could object to an arrangement that allows a nation to consume more than it produces. The answer lies in recognizing that such a situation has negative consequences in the present and dangerously adverse repercussions in the future. For example, the United States has run a substantial trade deficit for 4 decades, with imports surpassing exports by nearly $10 trillion over that period, including more than $500 billion per year since the turn of the century. That trade deficit allowed U.S. citizens to enjoy a standard of living more than $1,500 per person higher than would otherwise be possible. But mercantilists observe that these excess imports permit foreigners to obtain employment and profits from production that might otherwise benefit U.S. citizens. For example, in the decades after the U.S. trade deficit began to bloom in the 1970s, the massive sales of Japanese cars in the United States transferred millions of jobs out of the U.S. economy, according to accounting for high levels of unemployment in Detroit and low levels of unemployment in Tokyo. Just since the normalization of trade relations with China in 2000, U.S. manufacturing jobs have declined by 1/3, as trade deficit in manufactured goods alone has surpassed about $450 billion per year. Corporate profits and government tax revenues also accrue abroad rather than at home. However, the longer-term impact of trade deficits produces even greater anxiety. Simply put, trade deficits generate a form of indebtedness. Just as individuals cannot continue to spend more than they earn without eventually suffering detrimental consequences, the liabilities created by trade deficits threaten a nation's future. Unfortunately, the consequences of trade imbalances cannot be evaluated easily because they trigger complex and unpredictable flows of money, including some that occur years after the trade deficit itself. To understand this point, consider that the trade deficit in the United States means that more money flows out of the U.S. economy in the form of dollars to pay for imports that flow back into the U.S. economy through payments for U.S. goods purchased by foreigners. The consequences of the trade deficit depend in large part on what happens to those excess dollars, which would appear to be piling up abroad. In fact, some of these dollars are literally piling up abroad. About $500 billion of U.S. currency is currently held outside the United States. However, this cash held abroad is a mere drop in the bucket compared to the $10 trillion that has flowed out of the United States to pay for the excess of imports over exports since 1985. That year, the last time that Americans owned more assets abroad than foreigners owned of U.S. assets, marked the transformation of the United States from a net creditor nation to a debtor nation. Most of that $10 trillion has already found its way back into the U.S. economy as loans to Americans and purchases of U.S. financial assets. For example, the U.S. Treasury has borrowed over $2 trillion from foreign citizens and more than $4.1 trillion from foreign governments by selling them U.S. Treasury bonds and other securities. Not only must this debt be repaid someday, but foreigners now also receive over $100 billion in interest payments annually from the U.S. federal government. U.S. businesses owe foreigners another $3.2 trillion as a result of the sale of corporate bonds. About $6.4 trillion in stocks, about 15% of outstanding U.S. equities, are owned by foreigners. Such capital flows can offset a trade deficit temporarily, but render it harmless in the short run. But they can create future liabilities that only postpone the inevitable need to balance production and consumption. The U.S. is being sold to foreigners piece by piece to finance a trade deficit that continues to grow. Economists disagree about whether these developments ought to raise alarm. After all, the willingness of foreigners to invest in the United States and to lend money to Americans surely is an indication of confidence in the strength of the U.S. economy. More generally, as revealed in Chapter 9, capital flows can be beneficial to the economy and its future. Indeed, foreign capital is an essential ingredient to development in many third world countries. Whether capital flows produce effects that are on balance positive or negative depends heavily on the source of that capital, the terms on which it is acquired, the uses to which it is put, and the unpredictable future behavior of foreign lenders and investors. For example, should foreigners decide to use their $500 billion holdings in U.S. currency, about half of all dollars in circulation, to purchase U.S. goods, the result would be catastrophic. The increased demand for U.S. products would bid up prices and unleash massive inflation. Alternatively, should they try and exchange those dollars for other currencies, the increased volume of dollars available to in-currency markets would constitute excess supply that would trigger a violent collapse of the external value of the dollar. If owners of U.S. Treasury certificates, including Japan and China, sell their dollar denomination holdings and invest in euro or yen-dominated assets, U.S. interest rates would rise and the dollar would plummet. In 2007, Chinese officials threatened to use their dollar-denominated holdings to achieve political leverage in negotiations with the United States over these matters. In August 2011, an editorial in People's Daily, the official newspaper of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, called for halting purchases of U.S. Treasury bills to force the United States to abandon plans to sell arms to Taiwan. Even if none of these scenarios occur suddenly, as they did in Mexico, Argentina, Russia, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Korea, and Greece in recent years, over time, the excess supply of dollars is bound to erode the value of the dollar more gradually. No one can predict the timing or severity of this decline, but it has been long underway already. The dollar was once equivalent to 360 Japanese yen, but traded at about 120 yen late in 2015. The dollar declined from 1.18 euros in 2000 to euros by 2015. As the purchasing power of the dollar declines, the prices paid by Americans for foreign products, services, and investment assets will continue to increase, and the net worth of Americans, that is, U.S. national wealth, will decline. Thus, a trade deficit provides immediate benefits, but also risks reducing the standard of living for future generations. Americans who have grown accustomed to consuming far more than they produce will be forced to consume far less. Because these consequences are uncertain, nations vary somewhat in their tolerance for trade deficits, but most try to minimize or avoid them altogether, as counseled by mercantilists. Options in trade policy. To achieve their desired trade balance, nations often combine two mercantilist approaches. They may emphasize the expansion of exports through a strategy known as industrial policy. More commonly, they emphasize minimizing imports, a stance generally known as protectionism. Protectionist policies include many forms of import restriction designed to limit the purchase of goods from abroad. All allow domestic import competing industries to capture a larger share of the market and in the process to earn higher profits and to employ more workers at higher wages. The most traditional barriers are taxes on imports called tariffs or import duties, but they are no longer the main form of protectionism in most countries. In fact, declining from their peak in the 1930s, tariff levels throughout the world are now generally very low. In the United States, the average tariff rate reached a modern high of 59% in 1932, under what has been called a, quote, a remarkably irresponsible tariff law, unquote. The Smoot-Hawley Act, which has been widely credited with triggering a spiral of restrictions by other nations that helped plunge the global economy into the Great Depression of the 1930s. The average tariff rate in the United States was reduced to 25% after World War II and declined to about 2% after the Uruguay round of trade negotiations concluded in 1994. Most other countries have followed suit, and some have reduced rates even more, so that average tariff rates above 10% are now quite rare. However, in place of tariffs, the governments have responded to the pleas of industries threatened by foreign competition with a variety of non-tariff barriers, especially voluntary export restraints. In the most famous case of voluntary export restraints, Japanese auto workers, quote-unquote, voluntarily agreed to limit exports to the United States in 1981. Had Japan refused, a quota that would have been more damaging to Japanese automakers would have been imposed. A favorable trade balance can be sought through an industrial policy that promotes exports, especially in products that offer their strongest growth prospects. The simplest technique is the direct export subsidy, in which the government pays a domestic firm for each good exported so that it can compete with foreign firms that otherwise would have a cost advantage. A variety of other policies can be used to encourage promising industries, like those that spurred the internet and information technology, trusting that export gains will eventually follow. Such policies have at least three motivations. First, by increasing production in the chosen industry, they reduce the unemployment rate. Second, by enabling firms to gain a greater share of foreign markets, they give them greater leverage to increase prices and profits in the future. Third, increasing exports will improve the balance of trade and avoid the problem of trade deficits. Liberals are by no means indifferent to the dangers of trade deficits, but they argue that most mercantilist cures are worse than the disease. When mercantilist policies affect prices, they automatically create winners and losers, and in the process engender political controversies. For example, to raise revenue to pay for a subsidy, the domestic consumer has to pay higher taxes. As noted earlier, protectionism also harms the consumer by raising prices even while it benefits domestic firms that compete against imports. The multiple consequences of trade. As nations choose among policy options, they must acknowledge liberal theory's contention that free trade flows allow the market to efficiently allocate resources and thus to maximize global and national consumption. Nonetheless, governments almost universally restrict trade, at least to some degree. That is because governments seek many other outcomes from trade as well: full employment, long-term growth, economic stability, social harmony, power, security, and friendly foreign relations. Yet discover that these desirable outcomes are frequently incompatible with one another. Because free trade may achieve some goals but undermine others, governments that fail to heed the advice of liberal theory need not be judged ignorant or corrupt. Instead, they recognize a governmental responsibility to cope with all of trade's consequences, not only those addressed by liberal trade theory. For example, while trade affects the prices of individual products, global markets also influence which individuals and nations accumulate wealth and political power. Trade determines who will be employed and at what wage. It determines what natural resources will be used and at what environmental cost. It shapes opportunities and constraints in foreign policy. Because trade affects such a broad range of social outcomes, conflict among alternative goals and values is inevitable. As a result, both individuals and governments must face dilemmas that involve the multiple consequences of trade, the multiple goals of national policy, and the multiple values that compete to dominate in shaping behavior. The distributional effects of trade. Who wins, who loses? Many of these dilemmas stem from the sizable effects that international trade has had on the distribution of income and wealth among individuals, groups, and nations. Simply put, some gain material benefits from trade while others lose. Thus, to choose one trade policy and to reject others is simultaneously a choice of one income distribution over another. As a result, trade is inevitably politicized. Each group pressures its governments to adopt a trade policy from which it expects to benefit. The most visible distribution effects occur because trade policy often protects or promotes one industry or sector of the economy at the expense of others. For example, in response to pleas from the U.S. steel industry, President George W. Bush imposed a temporary 30% tariff on various types of imported steel in 2002. Because the import tax effectively added 30% to the price of steel imports, the U.S. steel industry could benefit from the protection against foreign competition by increasing its share of the market, by raising its own prices, or by a combination of the two. A larger market share or higher prices, or both, would certainly increase the profits of U.S. steel firms, which would benefit steel executives and stockholders and perhaps permit higher levels of employment and wage rates, which would benefit steel workers. Steel producers argued that the respite from foreign competition brought idled mills back online and kept teetering plants from shutting down, resulting in the resurrection of 16,000 steel jobs. Distributional effects are often regional as well as sectorial. The entire economy of steel producing areas would be boosted by the tariff because steel companies would purchase more goods from their suppliers, executives and workers would purchase more products, and the multiplier effect would spread and gain in jobs and profits throughout the regional economies where the steel industry is concentrated: Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. In fact, critics contend, and White House officials often have heartily denied, that the main purpose of the tariff was to boost the president's re-election prospects in those key electoral states. However, these gains represent only one side of the distributional effect, because there are losers as well as winners. For example, by making foreign-produced steel more expensive, the tariff also harmed domestic automakers who had to pay higher prices for the steel they used. Indeed, the representatives of auto-producing states like Michigan and Tennessee denounced the tariff. The president's own economic advisors, led by Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill, also opposed the tariff, bolstered by liberal theory's contention that the total losses would outweigh the total benefits. A report by the International Trade Commission estimated the cost to industries that consume steel at more than $680 million per year. This episode illustrates that most barriers to trade harm consumers because of higher prices, a point always emphasized by proponents of free trade. Trade policy also benefits some classes at the expense of others, a point more often emphasized by those who favor greater governmental control. For example, the elimination of trade barriers between the United States and Mexico under the terms of the North America Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, forces some U.S. manufacturing workers into direct competition with Mexican workers who earn a markedly lower wage. Since NAFTA guarantees that imports can enter the United States without tariffs, some U.S. businesses move to Mexico, where production costs are lower and U.S. workers lose their jobs in the process. Facing the threat of such production shifts, many more U.S. workers will accept a decline in wages, benefits, or working conditions. The losses from such wage competition will be greatest for unskilled workers in high-wage countries employed in industries that can move either their products or their production facilities more easily across national boundaries. But these losses also affect skilled workers in industries like steel and auto. Others, particularly more affluent professionals who face less direct competition from abroad, such as doctors, lawyers, and university professors, stand to gain from trade because it allows prices on the goods they consume. Of course, the greatest beneficiaries are the owners of businesses that profit from both lower wage rates and expanded markets. Proponents of free trade tend to de-emphasize these distributional effects and instead focus on the impact of trade and the economy as a whole. That is partly because liberal theory contends that free trade does not decrease employment, but only shifts it from an inefficient sector to one in which a nation has a comparative advantage. For example, U.S. workers losing their jobs to Mexican imports should eventually find unemployment in industries that export to Mexico. Proponents of free trade insist that it is far better to tolerate these quote-unquote transition costs, the short-term dislocations and distributional effects, than to protect an inefficient industry. Workers are not so sure, especially because short-term effects seem to last a lot longer than those who actually live through them, and because future prospects rarely compensate for present losses when security, stability, and peace of mind are factored in. Because these distributional consequences have such obvious political implications, The state is also much more attentive to them and than our economic theorists. That is one reason why all governments control trade to one degree or another. Of course, this does not mean that they do so wisely or fairly, in part because their decisions are shaped by patterns of representation among the consequences or the constituencies. Let me try that again. Of course, this does not mean that they do so wisely or fairly, in part because their decisions are shaped by patterns of representation among the constituencies whose material interests are affected by trade policy. In general, workers tend to be underrepresented, which is why trade policies so often encourage trade built on low wages that enrich business owners, but constrain the opportunities for workers. Moreover, as the discussion of trade deficits has indicated, the economic activities shaped by trade policies tend to affect current generations very differently from future ones, and the latter are seldom represented at all. The values dilemma. These distributional effects pose challenging trade-offs among competing values. For example, the effects of NAFTA were predicted to include somewhat lower prices for U.S. consumers, but also job losses or wage reduction for some unskilled U.S. workers. The positions taken on this issue by most individuals, however, did not hinge on their own national interests. Few could confidently foresee any personal impact of NAFTA, since the gains were estimated at well under 1% of GDP, and job losses were not expected to exceed a few 100,000 in a labor force of more than 100 million. However, the choice among competing values was plain. NAFTA meant gains in wealth, but also greater inequality and insecurity for workers. Some citizens acceded to the judgment of liberal theory that the country as a whole would be better off with freer trade, while others identified with the plight of workers who were more skeptical of liberal theory simply because for them the stakes were so much higher. After all, it is easy for a theorist to postulate that job losses in an important competing industry would be matched by job gains in an exporting firm, but it is harder for workers who have devoted their lives to one career to pack up and move to a strange town, hopeful that they might find a job that requires skills they may not possess in an unfamiliar industry. In the final analysis, NAFTA became a referendum on what kind of society people wished to live in. The decision was quintessentially American, one of greater wealth, but also greater inequality and insecurity. Other nations, which assess the trade-off between values differently, might have chosen an alternative policy toward trade and domestic inequality. Of course, distributional effects gave rise to other values as well, since the gains from NAFTA were expected to be greater for Mexico than for the United States. The conscientious citizen would also weigh whether it is better to help Mexican workers because they are poor or protect U.S. workers because they are U.S. citizens. As Chapter 11 implies, such issues of inequality in poor societies can translate directly into questions of life and death. As a result, the importance of trade policy, which has such a powerful impact on the distribution of gains and losses, is much higher in poor, dependent nations where trade constitutes half of the economy than in the United States, where it's closer to 10%. Perhaps the most challenging values trade-off concerned the trade policies that shift gains and losses from one time period to another. Such intergenerational effects arise from a variety of trade issues. For example, as discussed earlier, the U.S. trade deficit, like any form of debt, represents an immediate increase in consumption, but a postponement of its costs. The Japanese industrial policy of export promotion fosters a trade surplus, which produces the opposite effect in Japan. The subsidies the Japanese government pays to Japanese exporters requires Japanese citizens to pay both higher prices and higher taxes. However, the sacrifices of Japan's current generation may benefit future ones if the subsidy eventually transforms all infant industries into a powerful enterprise that can repay the subsidies through cheaper prices or greater employment. Similarly, Chinese currency policy has helped to expand exports and build future industrial capacity while increasing prices for current Chinese consumers. This spectacular growth of the Chinese economy would not have been possible without accepting those short-term sacrifices. The values dilemma encompasses much more than just an alternative angle on distributional effects. However, the debate over competitiveness, which began with the efforts of U.S. businesses to lower their production costs in order to compete with foreign firms, illustrates how trade considerations may imply a compromise of other societal values. Companies could lower their costs if the abolition of senior systems or age and gender discrimination laws allowed them to terminate employees at will. But that would leave workers vulnerable to the whim of a boss. Labor costs would be reduced if the minimum wage and workplace safety regulations were cut, if collective bargaining and labor unions were outlawed, and if pensions, health care, paid vacations and holidays, sick leave, and worker compensation for accidents were eliminated. But such actions entail a compromise of fundamental values that the kind of society in which people want to live. Government regulations that protect the environment, promote equality and social harmony, and achieve justice and security may add to production costs, but surely achieving economic interests is not worth abandoning all other values. Choosing between them is always difficult for a society because reasonable people can differ in the priority they ascribe to alternative values. Still, agreements on such matters can usually be forged within societies, in part because values tend to be broadly, if not universally, shared. Unfortunately, trade forces firms burdened by these value choices to compete with firms operating in countries that may not share them. This situation creates a dilemma for consumers, forcing them to balance economic interests against other values. For example, continuing to trade with nations that permit shabby treatment of workers or even outright human rights abuses poses a painful moral choice, not least because goods from such countries are often cheaper. During the 2011 debate over a trade agreement, Richard Trumka, president of the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organization, AFL-CIO, asked, "Would we approve an agreement in Colombia where 51 trade unionists were assassinated last year?" As Chapter 5 documents, foreign governments have often declared their opposition to human rights abuses because they have seldom supported their rhetoric with actions and effectively curtailed abusive practices. In fact, maintaining normative standards has fallen to consumers who must unwittingly answer key questions daily. Should we purchase cheap foreign goods like clothing and textiles, even though they may have been made with child labor or even slave labor? Or, of course, we seldom know the conditions under which these products were produced or even where they were produced. So we ask government to adopt policies to support principles we cannot personally defend with our own consumer behavior. Where values are concerned, we cannot, of course, expect everyone to agree with the choices we might make. Child labor remains a key source of comparative advantage for many countries Child labor remains a key source of comparative advantage for many countries in several industries prominent in international trade. We cannot expect them to give up easily a practice that is a major component of their domestic economy, and that is more offensive to us than to them. Fortunately, if trade competitors do not share our values, it may prove difficult to maintain these values ourselves unless we restrict trade, accept trade deficits, or design state policies to alleviate the most dire consequences. After all, it is hard to see how U.S. textile producers can compete with the sweatshops of Asia without creating sweatshops in New York. That point inevitably animates a complex debate over whether eliminating sweatshops would really benefit the poor, a dilemma of international trade that cannot be avoided merely by refusing to think about it. Foreign policy considerations, power and peace. Some of the most challenging value choices concern the effect of trade on the foreign policy goals pursued by states, especially power, peace, and national autonomy. Policymakers have long been aware that trade has two deep, if contradictory, effects on national security. On the one hand, trade contributes to national prosperity, which increases national power and enhances security. On the other hand, it has the same effect on a nation's trade partner, which could become a political or even military rival. The resulting ambivalent attitude is torn between the vision of states cooperating for economic gain and the recognition that they also use trade to compete for political power. The rise of China as a military and political competitor to the United States is a direct consequence of U.S. policy to encourage trade with China. While a market perspective sees neighboring nations as potential customers, the state must also see them as potential enemies. As a result, the state not only must consider the absolute gains it receives from trade, but also must weigh those gains in a relative term, perhaps even avoiding trade that would be more advantageous to its potential enemies than to itself. For this reason, states are attentive to the distribution of the gains from trade and selective about their trade partners, frequently encouraging them with some nations and banning it with others. While understandable, such policies sometimes lead to open conflict. In fact, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, contended that bitter trade rivalries were the chief cause of World War I and a substantial contributor to the outbreak of World War II. Both were precipitated by discriminatory trade policies in which different quotas or duties were imposed on the products of different nations. Hull, who believed free multilateral trade would build bridges rather than create chasms between peoples and nations, thus championed the non-discrimination principle and urged the creation of international institutions that would govern trade in accordance with it. Moreover, the Great Depression of the 1930s made it plain that international institutions are required to establish the rules of trade and create the international law that embodies them. In response, the United States sponsored the Bretton Woods trade and monetary regime, centered in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, IMF. Since 1946, GATT, which evolved into the World Trade Organization, WTO, in 1995, has convened 8 major negotiating sessions, referred to as rounds, in which nations exchange reductions in trade barriers. This bargaining is necessary to overcome the inclination of most nations to retain their own trade barriers while hoping other countries will lower theirs. The World Bank supports the effort by lending money to nations that might otherwise seek trade-limiting solutions to their financial problems. The IMF facilitates trade by providing a stable monetary system that permits the easy exchange of national currencies and the adjustment of trade imbalances. The result has been a dramatic increase in global trade. However, The pace of global trade negotiations has slowed dramatically in recent decades. The issues most eagerly pursued by rich countries, those that offer them the greatest benefit without requiring much sacrifice, have already been resolved. The remaining ones pose stark trade-offs that activate formidable political resistance, many surrounding the sensitive question of agriculture, which is a fragile and highly protected sector in which most rich countries, in most rich countries. Poor countries, which rely heavily on agriculture, have not been able to achieve progress in reducing either the import barriers or the subsidies enacted by rich countries that prevent their agricultural production from entering the most lucrative markets. Since the advent of the WTO, only one round of trade negotiations has convened at all. Since it commenced in Doha, Qatar in 2001, it has remained hopelessly deadlocked. As of late 2015, no progress was in sight. The Doha round was supposed to have enhanced a development agenda to benefit poor countries, especially in agriculture, but the priority has withered to the point that the World Bank has estimated that the plan on the table would net benefits of less than a penny a day to citizens of poor countries and actually harm most of Africa. While further progress in global trade agreements unlikely, the United States has instead used its economic and political might to negotiate arrangements with 20 individual countries as of 2015, as well as Trans-Pacific Partnership, discussed later. In between negotiating rounds, the GATT-WTO dispute resolution mechanism has provided a forum for diverting the inevitable skirmishes over trade into the legal arena rather than the military realm. Immediately after the controversial steel tariff introduced by President Bush in March of 2002, the European Union lodged a complaint that was upheld by the WTO. This episode demonstrated that if mercantilist policies are controversial in the nations that enact them, they are met with even greater hostility by the nations with which they trade. Despite the presence of international institutions, trade disputes are generally resolved as much by power in service to economic interests as by institutions that champion principles. The United States has been locked in a dispute with Brazil and more than a dozen other nations, plus the EU, which since 2002 has won 3 WTO judgments that U.S. subsidies of its cotton production violate free trade obligations. These subsidies have allowed the United States to become the largest cotton exporter in the world, while depressing global cotton prices and displacing production by poor farmers in many countries. The Oxfam has estimated that eliminating these illegal subsidies would provide revenue to feed 1 million children per year, especially in West Africa. In bilateral negotiations, finally concluded in 2010, Brazil accepted an annual cash payment to settle the dispute, but congressional action on the 2012 Farm Bill deleted the necessary appropriation. Theoretically, free trade can bind nations together in peaceful interdependence, but actual trade practice is fraught with conflict. At the regional level, a similar belief in the efficacy of free trade as a guarantor of peace was an important motivation for the initiative that eventually led to the creation of the European Union. In both the EU and Bretton Woods, policymakers saw several ways that an open and institutionalized trading system could promote peace among nations. The institutions themselves could weaken the hold of nationalism and mediate conflict between nations. Trade-induced contact could break down nationalistic hostility among societies. Multilateralism, non-discrimination, could tend to prevent the development of grievances among states. Interdependence could constrain armed conflict and foster stability, while the economic growth generated by trade could remove the desperation that leads nations to aggression. European integration was launched in 1951 with the founding of the European Coal and Steel Community, ECSC, which internationalized an industry that was key not only for the economies of the 6 nations involved, but also for war-making potential. With production facilities scattered among different countries, each became dependent on the others to provide them both demand for the final product and part of the supply capacity. This arrangement fulfilled the liberal dream of an interdependence that would prevent war by making it economically suicidal. In fact, the ECSC was an innovative form of peace treaty designed in the words of Robert Schuman to, quote-unquote, make it plain that any war between France and Germany becomes not merely unthinkable, but materially impossible. The most recent step to encourage European trade was the creation of a new regional currency, the euro, to replace national currencies in 2001. Freed from the complications of multiple currencies that fluctuate in trade and value, trade and investment flourished, but the Greek debt crisis, discussed later, demonstrates that the resulting independence can transmit negative conditions like financial instability across national borders, just as surely as it can spread prosperity. Institutional efforts to secure global peace required the exercise of power. According to hegemonic stability theory, one dominant nation, a hegemon, will usually have to subsidize the organizational costs and frequently offer side benefits in exchange for cooperation. For example, the massive infusion of foreign aid provided to Europe by the United States under the Marshall Plan in the late 1940s was a key inducement in the creation of the Bretton Woods system. Maintaining the capability to handle these leadership requirements entails substantial costs. For example, U.S. expenditures for defense, which have been many times higher than those of nations with which it has competed since World War II, erode the competitiveness of U.S. business by requiring higher tax levels. They constrain the funds available to spend on other items that could enhance competitiveness, and they divert a substantial share of U.S. scientific and technological expertise into military innovation and away from commercial areas. The trade-off between competitiveness and defense may be judged differently by different individuals, but it can be ignored by none. International cooperation and national autonomy. International institutions may be necessary to facilitate trade and to alleviate the conflict that inevitably surrounds it, but it can also create conflict. Institutions require hegemonic leadership, but many critics complain that the United States benefits so much from its capacity to dictate the rules under which institutions operate that they have become extensions of U.S. imperialism. Institutions seek to maintain fair competition among firms in different countries, which is essential to the international trading system, but they must also do so without undermining the national sovereignty and autonomy that are central to the modern state system. Trade disputes test the capacity of institutions to balance these imperatives, because one nation will often defend its policy as a rightful exercise of national sovereignty, while another challenged it as an unfair barrier to trade. Since governments have many compelling motives for enacting policies that affect trade, clashes of values often appear as struggles over the rightful boundaries of sovereignty. Such disagreements can be settled by appeal to GATT or more recently to the WTO, but not even the WTO's chief sponsor, the United States, accepts the dominion of the WTO without serious reservations about its intrusion into affairs historically reserved for national governments. Indeed, even though the U.S. administration strongly supported the creation of the WTO in 1995 to prevent trade violations by other nations, a surprising variety of U.S. groups opposed its ratification because it might encroach on U.S. sovereignty. Environmental groups such as Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, and the Sierra Club were joined not only by consumer advocates like Ralph Nader, but also by conservatives such as Ross Perot, Pat Buchanan, and Jesse Helms, who feared that a WTO panel could rule the various U.S. government policies constituted unfair trade practices, even though they were designed to pursue values utterly unrelated to trade. For example, EU automakers have challenged the U.S. law that establishes standards for auto emissions and fuel economy. Buchanan said, WTO means putting America's trade under foreign bureaucrats who will meet in secret to demand changes in the United States laws. WTO tramples all over the American sovereignty and states' rights. Because the WTO could not force a change in U.S. law, GATT Director General Peter Sutherland called this position, quote-unquote, errant nonsense. But the WTO could impose sanctions or authorize an offended nation to withdraw trade concessions as compensation for the injury. Soon thereafter, the United States found itself on the other side of the clash between fair competition and national sovereignty when it appealed to the WTO to rule that the EU's prohibition of beef containing growth hormones violated the quote-unquote national treatment principle contained in GATT's Article 3. Since almost all cattle raised in the United States are fed growth hormones and very few European cattle are, the United States contended that the EU rule was simply disguised protectionism that unfairly discriminated against U.S. products. The EU contended that such beef was a cancer risk and that as a sovereign power, it had the right, indeed responsibility, to establish whatever health regulations it chose to protect its citizens. The WTO ruled in favor of the United States, incurring the wrath of those who saw this as an example of national democratic processes being overruled by undemocratic global ones. Can it be long before Colombia challenges U.S. drug laws as discriminating against marijuana while favoring Canadian whiskey? Neither can regional agreements avoid this clash between fair competition in trade and national autonomy. The first trade dispute under NAFTA involved a challenge by the United States to regulations under Canada's Fisheries Act, established to promote conservation of herring and salmon stocks in Canada's Pacific coast waters. Soon thereafter, the Canadian government challenged the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency regulations that require the phasing out of asbestos, a carcinogen no longer permitted as a building material in the United States. Similarly, critics of the EU worry that it is leveling of the playing field for trade competition also threatens to level cultural and political differences among nations. Denmark, for example, found that free trade made it impossible to maintain a sales tax rate higher than neighboring Germany's, because Danish citizens could simply evade the tax by purchasing goods in Germany and bringing them across the border duty-free. Competitive pressures also make it difficult for the nation to adopt policies that impose costs on business when low trade barriers force firms to compete with those in other countries that do not bear such burdens. For example, French firms demand a level playing field in competing with Spanish firms whenever the French government mandates employee benefits, health, and safety rules or environmental regulations more costly than those in Spain. In fact, free trade and the institutions created to sustain its pressure pressures nations to harmonize many policies, but not without significant risks. Together with the elimination of tariff barriers, the creation of the euro certainly facilitated increased trade among European nations. But it also allowed the ballooning trade deficit in several countries by enabling the capital flows that financed them. By 2009, the resultant debt left Greece, whose imports were 3 times higher than its exports, teetering on the brink of default on loans from European banks. Before the Greek drachma was replaced by the euro, Greece could have eased trade deficits by allowing the drachma to decline in value, which would have increased exports and discouraged imports. With that option foreclosed, Greece instead sought to dampen imports through austerity policies that shrank the economy by a quarter and pushed unemployment over 25%. Threatening the stability of the European banking system, the Greek collapse spread to Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Ireland, among others. By the end of 2015, only stopgap measures that had prevented continent-wide disaster, but the underlying problem remained unsolved. Tight interdependence offers familiar trade benefits, but also risks crisis contagion. Some trade barriers are designed to protect unique aspects of the economic, social, and political life of nations, especially when trade affects cultural matters of symbolic importance. For example, France imposes limits on the percentage of television programming that can originate abroad, allegedly in defense of French language and custom. The obvious targets of these restrictions, U.S. producers of movies and youth-oriented music, contend that the French are simply protecting their own inefficient entertainment industry. They argue that programming deserves the same legal protection abroad that the foreign television sets and disc players that display these images receive in the United States. But if we restrict trade because we oppose child labor or rainforest destruction, how can we object when other countries ban the sale of U.S. projects because they violate their values, such as music and Hollywood films that celebrate sex, violence, and free expression of controversial ideas, or even blue jeans, McDonald's, hamburgers, and other symbols of U.S. cultural domination? The Trans-Pacific Partnership. The most recent effort to expand trade is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, negotiated between 2008 and 2015 by 12 nations, including the United States, Japan, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, but also Mexico, Peru, Chile, Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Brunei. As of late 2015, the ongoing ratification process in all 12 countries reflected the dilemmas discussed earlier, dominated by arguments that were eerily similar to those that surrounded previous multilateral trade agreements. The distributional effects implicit in all trade, that some will gain and others will lose, drove the politics of ratification. Proponents emphasized export expansion through tariff reductions. The Barack Obama administration cited a decline in over 18,000 tariffs imposed on U.S. exports by foreign countries, producing a state-by-state report of that would benefit The Barack Obama administration cited a decline in over 18,000 tariffs imposed on U.S. exports by foreign countries, producing a state-by-state report of products that would benefit from increased sales to the other 11 economies. Most U.S. businesses with significant foreign sales accordingly supported the TPP. Opponents, especially smaller businesses that sell primarily to the domestic market, emphasized that TPP mandated reduction in U.S. tariffs that would harm U.S. firms competing against imports. The tariffs reductions contained in the TPP are less relevant for these distributional effects than those of earlier trade accords, however, because tariffs no longer constitute the chief barrier to export growth nor the principal protection against imports. For example, Japan charges no tariffs on U.S. automobiles, yet for decades the U.S. auto industry has complained that many other aspects of Japanese markets not addressed by the TPP add more than $10,000 to the price of U.S.-made automobiles in Japan. The U.S. auto industry cites as evidence that U.S. manufacturers sell about 13,000 cars per year in Japan, while Japanese companies sell no more in the United States per day, sell more than the United States per day. The U.S. trade deficit with Japan in the auto sector alone exceeds $50 billion per year. While both Ford Motor Company and the unions that represent its workers oppose the TPP because it eliminates U.S. tariffs of 25% charged against Japanese light trucks, their most vehement criticism is that the TPP does not address the unfair manipulation of currency exchange rates that make U.S. products expensive abroad and foreign products cheap in the United States. The prominence of the issue derives from the concern that the TPP will eventually add new members that are notorious for currency manipulation, especially China and Thailand. Since the TPP would benefit sectors and harm import competing sectors in all 12 countries, some governments plan to offset the damage to vulnerable groups with increased spending designed to purchase political support. In Japan, the Shinzo Abe administration has proposed $30 billion in aid to Japanese agriculture, and Canada plans $4.3 billion in support of dairy farmers who will lose tariff protection. In the United States, the greatest controversy over distributional consequences mirrors the opposition to NAFTA, namely that U.S. workers would be forced into direct competition with foreign workers who earn markedly less and enjoy poor working conditions with fewer rights. Poor word choice with enjoy there. Anyway, this is the so-called race to the bottom that has motivated virtually all U.S. labor unions to oppose most trade accords, including the TPP. As a consequence, most Democrats, with the notable exception of President Obama, oppose the TPP, and most Republicans, save Donald Trump, align with business in supporting it. This partisan pattern is familiar from the NAFTA debate and is also echoed in Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, where liberal groups are wary of the accordance of conservatives are wary of the accord, and conservatives support it. As one unionist put it, the TPP is a dream for corporations, but a nightmare for workers. The 6,000-page TPP agreement also poses familiar dilemmas involving competing values and national sovereignty, with critics especially concerned that democratic processes were circumvented in the secretive negotiation process and will be similarly sidestepped in its implementation. During the 6 years of negotiations, the only input from the American public came through 28 advisory committees, whose composition was heavily tilted toward corporate interests. The Washington Post reported that of the 566 committee members, 480, 85%, were from private industry and their trade associations, while only 31 came from labor organizations and just 16 from non-governmental organizations. More than half of the committees were made up entirely of corporate representatives, and another quarter contained only a single corporate member. For example, given the Intellectual Property Rights Advisory Committee, given that the Intellectual Property Rights Advisory Committee included representatives of pharmaceutical companies but no non-corporate members, it is hardly surprising that the TPP requires all 12 nations to extend copyright protections that greatly increase prices for life-saving drugs. If critics were concerned by the drafting of the TPP outside the open political processes expected in a democratic nation, they are even more alarmed by provisions of the TPP that replace domestic institutions with international ones. At issue are the mechanisms to be used in adjudicating disputes that inevitably arise in any business transaction, but are especially common in international trade matters that involve multiple government jurisdictions. Businesses are understandably reluctant to rely upon judicial proceedings in foreign countries, especially when a foreign government is a party to the dispute. Thus, they have pressed for so-called investor-state dispute settlement systems to be incorporated into all recent trade agreements. Modeled after WTO tribunals, the TPP permits corporations to challenge government policies that erode their profits in specifically convened expert panels consisting of 3 private lawyers rather than domestic courts. Critics see this as a violation of national sovereignty and an interference with democratic processes. For example, consumer groups note that the TPP will result in increased imports of food from countries with suspect safety standards, especially seafood from Malaysia. Such concerns about food safety are hardly new, and U.S. law consequently requires that certain categories of meat contain labeling information on the country of origin so that consumers might judge the risk for themselves. However, in 2012, an expert panel ruled that the U.S. law violates WTO rules, since the TPP would greatly expand the number of corporations eligible to pursue such remedies. Critics fear that all manners of consumer protections may be swept away. Environmentalists have been on the leading edge of such criticism. The TPP as a whole, is a frontal assault on environmental and climate safeguards, says Friends of the Earth President Eric Pica, raising the specter of corporate profits dominating all other values that nations may legitimately wish to pursue. The Sierra Club has noted that ExxonMobil and Chevron have used rules in past agreements to challenge policies, including a national gas fracking moratorium in Canada, a court order to pay for oil pollution in Ecuador, and environmental standards for a coal-fired power plant in Germany. Such challenges would be heard by trade tribunals that could order governments to pay fossil fuel firms for the profits they hypothetically would have earned if the climate protections being challenged had not been enacted. In short, the TPP offers the undeniable benefits of expanded trade, but these benefits are not free. They come at the expense of compromises with dilemmas involving distributional effects, alternative values, and limitations on national sovereignty. Choices for nations and individuals. Few would deny the contention of liberal theory that trade permits a higher level of aggregate consumption than would be possible if consumers were prevented from purchasing foreign products. It is hard to imagine modern life without the benefits of trade. Of course, it does not follow that trade must be utterly unrestricted, because the aggregate economic effect tells only part of the story. As mercantilists remind us, trade also carries with it important social and political implications. Trade shapes the distribution of income and wealth among individuals, affects the power statuses and the relations among them, and constrains or enhances the ability of both individuals and nations to achieve goals built on other values. Thus, trade presents a dilemma for nations. No policy can avoid some of trade's negative consequences without also sacrificing some of its benefits. That is why most governments have sought to encompass elements of both liberalism and mercantilism in fashioning their trade policies. The same is true for individuals, because every day each individual must, explicitly or implicitly, assume a stance on the dilemmas identified in this chapter. In turn, trade forces individuals to consider some of the following discussion questions that require normative judgments, as well as a keen understanding of the empirical consequence of trade. We must always remember to ask not only what trade policy will be best to achieve our goals, but also what our goals should be. Discussion questions. 1. Are your views closer to those of a liberal or mercantilist? 2. Is it patriotic to purchase domestic products? Why or why not? 3. Does one owe a greater obligation to domestic workers and corporations than to foreign ones? 4. Should one purchase a product that is cheap, even though it was made with slave labor or by workers deprived of human rights? 5. Should a country surrender some of its sovereignty in order to receive the benefits of joining the WTO? 6. Should one lobby the U.S. government to restrict the sales of U.S. forestry products abroad because these products compromise the environment?